This video will consist primarily of me reading from my recent blog posts. My blog is linked to in the description. In this video I will also be interjecting some commentary as it occurs to me. So first I'm going to address the social construct canard that race deniers put out to try to make it impossible to discuss the issue of race meaningfully. I did explain why it is invalid to conceive of race as a social construct in a previous video made in response to the skeptical heretic.
Arbitrary social construct, arbitrary social construct, arbitrary social construct.
Here I will be more concise. So this piece is entitled Deconstructing Social Constructs. Race refers to phenotypically distinct branches of the human species. The concept has sociological implications, but the concept itself refers to human biology, which is constructed genetically, not socially. It is possible for an individual to grasp the concept of race, or of biogeographic ancestry, or whatever terminology you want to use to describe phenotypically distinct branches of the human species. It is possible for an individual to grasp the concept by way of his own observation of groups of individuals who possess visibly distinctive traits. So the existence of race does not require social validation, let alone social construction. Common observable phenotypes among populations are explained by genetics, not society. But the concept of race has meaning because of the observable manifestations of genetic variations, not the percentage of genetic dissimilarity. Humans are 98% chimpanzee genetically, and you could break down a human being to all his chemical components that might exist in a laboratory. You could put all those chemicals and mix them together, but those chemicals wouldn't constitute a human, wouldn't distinguish a human conceptually from other existence. The chemistry of humans underlies, but does not define humans. The essence of race is phenotypical variation, not the genotypical variation that underlies it. Phenotypes logically can't be sociological. If you are going to call common observable phenotypes among populations, such as skin color, social constructions, even though it is possible to observe skin color outside of a social context because skin color exists biologically, then you have rendered the term social construct meaningless insofar as all concepts would be social constructs, including the universe itself. So to be consistent, if I were an astronomer attempting to describe Jupiter, you would have to try to undermine the information I'm giving you by telling me that Jupiter and all planets are just social constructs. Now there is some disagreement among astronomers on whether Pluto qualifies as a planet, but there is no disagreement on whether planet is a valid concept that describes actual objects in space and differentiates them from other objects such as comets and stars. Concepts that reference existence can't be referring to things that are socially constructed. Social constructs could only refer to such things as laws, mores, customs, etc., things that don't actually exist in reality, only as concepts derived from social interactions. Anti-discrimination laws are social constructs, but in order for any laws against racial discrimination to be enforceable, races must be presumed to exist. Otherwise, one accused of discrimination could prove his innocence by demonstrating that he couldn't have possibly discriminated based on race, since races don't exist. And social constructs don't have any legal rights or standing to claim discrimination anyway. No black person or a white person who might claim discrimination actually exists except as a social construct, according to the logic of social constructivism. Do you see why the distinction between purely social concepts and actual existence in reality is useful? It's a distinction the Orwellian abusers of language want to obliterate in the name of prescribing an egalitarianism for the human species that nature failed to produce. Ironically, in denying the existence of race deniers aren't preventing racism from existing, they are rather preventing themselves from identifying anyone as racist. So the whole social construct canard is just about introducing philosophical and semantic word games to try to obfuscate and inhibit any meaningful discussion of race. If you try to describe race, they'll say, no, races don't exist, but populations do, but phenotypes associated with race exist, but race itself doesn't. On and on and on. It's intellectually dishonest. It's meant to confuse, not to inform. Now, the opposition that race realists are most likely to come up against comes not from the committed race deniers, but from the more casual, more mainstream race minimizers or race superficialists. These are people who believe that, yes, races do exist, racial differences do exist, but they are all superficial. And this is what most people in the West are brought up to believe, that race just means skin color, and it is wrong to draw any distinctions among races beyond identification of skin color and maybe hair texture and other superficial features, but certainly. So race superficialists believe that while on the outside we may look different, on the inside we're all the same. Our minds are wired exactly the same. No race has any greater intellectual capacity or any greater proclivity for crime or anything else. And so race superficialists have to try to explain disparities in academic performance and in crime rates based on other factors, based on environment or based on culture. And most conservatives and libertarians and objectivists will ascribe to culture the explanation for the phenomenon of violent black flash mobs and high rates of violent black crime generally. Well, I ask, is black a culture? From where does culture come? Culture is an expression of some aspects of the nature of the people who create it. From where does culture come? Culture is an expression of some aspects of the nature of the people who create it. Do black cultural expressions, such as mob attacks, have at least some genetic precursors? I think so. Do males exhibit more aggression than females because male behavior is cultural, or because male behavior is innate? The options aren't mutually exclusive. What about teenagers? Are they impulsive and rebellious because of culture, or because of something inherent in being a teenager? The law rightly presumes that an 18-year-old man can choose not to engage in crime just as absolutely as a 40-year-old woman can. But that doesn't entail any belief that the crime rates in those groups will ever be equal. Choice is exercised within an individual's own context, and that context includes innate and environmental inputs. Blacks everywhere, from South Africa to Britain to Brazil to the U.S., exhibit high rates of violent crime relative to other races in those same countries. Different cultures around the world don't seem to produce different results, at least not different enough to make racial crime disparities go away. But the strongest evidence for black crime being partly explainable by genetics are actual physiological characteristics associated with blacks. They include differences in skull shape and size, which correspond to differences in brain structure, which help explain why blacks have an average IQ of about 80 compared to 100 for whites and 105 for East Asians. Now, black IQs are actually closer to 70 in most sub-Saharan African countries, where Negroid genetics are purer than in blacks in the U.S., who average around 25% white or other admixture. Lower IQ is correlated with less rational, more impulsive behavior. Also, blacks tend to have higher testosterone levels, which correlates positively with aggressiveness. Variation exists in the distribution of the hormones, brain size and shape, and other factors that correlate with statistical variation in crime rates among races. As Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute reports, quote, "The face of violent crime in New York, like in every other large American city, is almost exclusively black and brown. Blacks committed 80% of all shootings in the first half of 2009. Together, blacks and Hispanics committed 98% of all shootings. Blacks committed nearly 70% of all robberies. Whites, by contrast, committed 5% of all violent crimes in the first half of 2009. The premise of innate racial differences predicts the persistency and consistency of racial crime disparities across time, culture, politics, and geography. The premise of innate racial equality has zero predictive value and no scientific basis. It is a pre-Darwinian notion that supposes human traits appeared suddenly from some source other than the adaptive process which gave different human populations in different parts of the world different traits, some of which pertain to cognitive abilities and behavioral tendencies. Variation in the distribution of hormones, brain size and shape, and other factors correlate with observable variation in crime rates among races and help explain incorrigibly high rates of black crime in particular." Now, in contrast to what I just said about genetic variation among races having something to do with variation in crime rates among races, the standard default position of most people is race superficialism. So, people will demand that if you assert that there are racial differences, that you prove beyond the superficial characteristics how there could possibly be any provable differences in people's behavioral or intellectual tendencies. But this is illogical to assume as a default that people are innately equal. I mean, it makes no sense if you understand evolution. The default position, purely from logic and observation, is that variation exists in the distribution of behavioral tendencies among human populations. So what you can do when you're arguing with a race superficialist is turn the tables and say, now, if you have evidence that the organs, hormones, and genes regulating mental functioning, sex drive, and aggression are, against all odds, absolutely 100% equal among the races, then it's up to you to present that evidence. If you don't have evidence for innate equalitarianism, then I will reject equalitarian arguments on race as being unfounded. Race superficialists believe, as the race deniers do, that heritable racial traits have nothing to do with intelligence or behavior. Nothing, as in not even a fraction of a percent to do with intelligence or behavior. It's either all culture, all environment, all choice, all factors external to one's own genetic makeup. Race superficialism and race denial are based on socially prescribed ideology, on dogma, as against science, as against even common sense. A cursory understanding of evolution and the application of a little common sense would tell you that if evolution drew such sharp distinctions among races in terms of skin color, skull shape, and soft tissue facial features, it probably had some effect on the brain as well. Genetic sameness is a conclusion that can only be supported on ideological grounds, just like the geocentric universe was.